I'd like to welcome Mark Cutifani, the long-serving Chief Executive of Anglo American, one of the biggest mining companies in the world. Mark, welcome.
Thank you very much, Neil. Great to be here.
Now let's get straight into this topic, commodity supercycles. There's been a lot of discussion about this over the past year as we've seen sort of prices sweep higher. A lot of people are arguing that we are in a supercycle and this one's going to be driven by the energy transition. I mean, do you agree with that premise? Do you think we are heading for a commodity supercycle? Or is this different to what we saw back in the early 2000s when Chinese demand drove everything higher?
Yeah, I think we're in a different type of cycle. The reason I don't call it a supercycle is rising tide, all boats rise. I don't see that yet. In fact, I think it's a lot more complex, and it's important to understand what the drivers are. I see energy transition, I see supply issues, I see exploration and development constraints, and those factors, plus a few others, are driving different parts of the industry. So they'll have different timeframes and different peak positions. So I don't see it as a simple super cycle as we experienced previously. I see it as something more complex and something that investors need to think or be a little more thoughtful about in terms of making the right decisions on investment.
Okay, so you can't just bet on everything rising as we saw previously. There's going to be things that are going at different paces, more volatility. That's kind of how you would see it? Yeah, I think the energy transition stuff, so copper, nickel, lithium, cobalt, PGMs, will be impacted by the energy transition, but nickel, copper, lithium will be impacted earlier in the cycle because they will be connected to batteries, but hydrogen will be a later stage driver of PGM prices. So understanding that difference will be important, but that, one would argue, is a super cycle that we're moving into on transition metals. Mm-hmm. On supply issues, the fact we haven't been exploring and finding stuff in diamonds, rare earths are tight, I think that's a supply issue that's longer term. So again, I think that's the driver. And then you've got iron ore, and in particular quality iron ore, where companies haven't been able to develop the quality that's needed in the marketplace and the volumes required, is a different type of piece. So you have to sort of think about Guinea and say, gee, when can that get going? And that will change the dynamics on the iron ore side. And then you've got thermal coal not being invested in. And so you've got to take a bet about when you think demand and supply dynamics will turn around as the energy transition occurs. So in some cases, you're betting against different commodities. And I know the hedge guys will look at that and say, you know what, there are bets I can make both ways. So you really have to think differently than thinking like you're in a massive super cycle. I think it's a very different psychology required here. Okay, but for those battery metals you referenced there, you would see structurally higher prices coming through because of, well, the big demand. We're already seeing that in EVs, aren't we, in renewables, plus supply side constraints. I mean, it's not easy to find a big new copper mine anymore, is it? And once you do find it, it's not easy to get it permitted and, licensed.
Absolutely. I think firstly, if I talk about all the metals and mineral products, used to take 7 years from discovery to development in a commodity that you thought was pretty robust. Today, despite best intentions and will, it's probably more like 15 years. Wow. And in some cases, it's 20, depending on the jurisdiction and the various issues that you have to navigate. And so that in of itself is a constraint on the supply side, which will support very strong prices. And when you've got then demand on the energy transition, you've got that really under pressure. And that's where I think the big changes will occur. But as a consequence, I think you then start to have to deal with potential substitution in some of those metals. And you've got to think about that very carefully, because the stronger the run and the quicker the run up, the more likely people are going to look pretty hard for substitutes. And in our industry, we've got a history of seeing substitutes change the dynamics very quickly.
So substitutes would be what, we're just swapping one metal, increased use of scrap, or sort of technological breakthroughs? I mean, all of those things?
All of the above. So in batteries, I can see PGM substituting nickel and cobalt over time if those products really jump through the roof in terms of pricing. And I tell the story about tantalum and the use of tantalums in computers and their use for the capacitors. Most efficient way to store energy and move energy around on a computer or on your cell phone. But when you couldn't get tantalum, Mr. Dell said, you know, what's tantalum and where the hell do I get it? And when nobody could give him the answer, multi-layer ceramic capacitors got developed pretty quickly and put one hell of a dent in the tantalum market. So, you know, our industry is littered with these examples. Mr. Musk has talked about copper, and if the price of copper goes too far, he'll look at some substitution. Now, the practical issues are that will take time, and with copper being such a broad use metal, that's not so easy. And so I think copper looks pretty robust. But some of those smaller use metals are much more exposed to the vagaries of substitution.
Do you think the industry is going to be able to supply the metals that are needed for the transition, well, especially in the transition space? I mean, you see some of the forecasts out there. They're quite, you know, aggressive, aren't they? And given some of the issues you've outlined there, I mean, are we going to be facing big supply shortfalls, do you think, as this transition happens?
So I think we're going to be facing supply constraints. I've got no doubt. Governments aren't geared to push these projects through and support their development. Over a long period of time, developed countries have progressively abrogated their responsibilities with respect to mining the minerals that the world needs to support our way of life and to make sure that we're maintaining environmental standards, because metals are critical to maintaining environmental standards. And people sometimes get confused the fact that we use less than 0.5% of the Earth's surface to drive water purification, agricultural productivity. We're critical to making sure we can grow forests and drive plant production productively, that they forget that if you don't have the minerals, then you've got a much bigger problem. And remember too, the world may be growing at 3%, but we're trying to eradicate poverty, which means you're building a middle class. And so metals and minerals intensity will grow at more than 3%, depending on how good the new technologies are that are being developed. But that's going to take time. So at the moment, I think we're staring down the gun barrel of being short copper and a number of commodities to feed or to support the energy transition and to support growth more generally.
Yeah, but it does seem that the industry's role in providing that is kind of underappreciated by the rest of society, doesn't it? But, you know, here are the crucial buttons. Yeah, they do feel that they're more and more distrusted, I think, more possibly by people.
Yeah, so and I wouldn't put that at the feet of everyone else. I put it at our feet first, saying we haven't explained our role in society enough. And you know, you've heard me gab on enough, but I think we've all got to do that much better. I think we've got to spend time with governments and helping them understand the ramifications of not supporting mineral development. And at the same time, we have to make sure that our projects are developed responsibly, risks are taken into proper account, we work with local communities, and we're making contributions to those local industries or local communities above and beyond just creating jobs, because the unintended consequences of our activities by just focusing on jobs is goods and services probably rise, the costs of those goods and services rise when you've got miners who are relatively well paid. So our contribution has to be in infrastructure and making other benefits, or so people can see other benefits to be supportive of our mine development. So we have to think very differently as industry players. We have to connect with our stakeholders in a very different way and explain our position. And we have to become partners with a whole range of community and government players.
Okay. Just moving on, I mean, we talked about the energy transition there, but something you mentioned was agriculture. Now, we have got a growing global population. We're going to need to feed more people from the same kind of footprint. So where does that leave things like fertilizers? I mean, you've got a big new mine you're trying to in the north of England. I mean, is that another commodity that could be headed for a super cycle?
Look, we believe that polyhalite is a very different type of product. There's a category of products that I talk about that could also benefit, and I won't call it a supercycle. What I'll say is new technologies, new approaches, driving improved productivities in the agricultural sector. And the beauty of polyhalite, it's multi-nutrient, low salt, low carbon footprint. So it's got all the environmental characteristics that people want, and it helps improve agricultural productivity. So we think it's a product for the future. We've got a large scale, largest deposit in the world, and we think that's something that will benefit. And we've already seen a 60 to 70% price increase for other products, which then reflects in our price. So yeah, we're pretty excited, but we think it's a different set of dynamics. It's new technology, new approaches, and we've got to create a new market. But we're certainly very excited in terms of its potential.
There's going to be good demand coming through there, isn't there? I mean,
well, yeah, and it's a bit like if you think about lithium and the new demand and new applications, new technologies, it's the agricultural version of lithium, cobalt, and those technologies. What we've got to make sure of, it's accessible and priced appropriately so we don't price ourselves out of the market. But at this stage, it looks like a pretty good bet. It's going to take a bit of time, but it's a great place to be. And the thing that we've been thinking through very carefully at Anglo American, because of this complexity by commodity, the fact that we've got a spread of commodities that we would call future facing, and probably 85% of our portfolio, but across a number of commodities, certainly gives us flexibility and the ability to allocate our capital, we hope, better than most in terms of where the potential really sits.
Is lithium interesting to you or not, or is the market not big enough there?
Look, it's very interesting. If we stub our toe and find something in those areas that we're exploring, we'd be thrilled to develop a lithium deposit. I have experience with lithium in the old Greenbushes days, so I understand the hard rock market, but there's still a lot of lithium out there. You talk about the brines and a whole range of hard rock products. So not all lithium makes money. And our view is that buying lithium, you're probably going to pay at the top end of the market, but if you can find one and it's a good quality one, then that would be a great opportunity. So we think the better bet is to explore, or if we see something that's underappreciated, we might have a look at it, but it's a tougher bet to find. We think the broader base metal suite, the precious metal suites, are the areas where we can best crack new exploration developments that really do create long-term value. But if while we're there, we kick our foot on some lithium, we'd be absolutely thrilled.
And you mentioned their future-facing commodities. I mean, you've got a big steel ingredients business, coking coal, iron ore. Is steel a future-facing commodity? I mean, China will presumably peak in terms of demand in the next, 5 years or so. I mean, can you really see steel as a kind of future-facing commodity in this transition?
Yeah, we do. We think that green steel is the future-facing commodity that we all have to think about. So transitioning from met coal to hydrogen and other materials, more recycle will be the key. But steel's critical for infrastructure, continuing urbanisation, reducing our human footprint and making sure that we're protecting the globe. But steel's absolutely critical. In fact, it's a key part of the energy transition and making sure that we reduce our human footprint and reduce our impact on the environment. So I think it's a long-term play. So having high-quality iron ore, and the difference between high-quality iron ore and low-quality, let's say 58% Pilbara product versus 67% Minas Rio product, is about 30% in carbon generation in the downstream processes. So we think we've got a big advantage there. And over time, we've got a high-quality met coal, which will allow us to help transition as environmentally sensitively as we can. But by mid-30s, we think hydrogen starts to play a much bigger role in the quest for green steel. So we've got the iron ore, and we think we can play a role in the hydrogen economy as well. So we think that's where we've got to be, which means met coal probably for us comes to the end of its life towards 2035, 2040. But new technologies, carbon capture, maybe that'll make a difference. That's what Timber and the guys are looking at. But at the moment, that's how we're thinking and that's how we're planning.
And that goes back to what you were saying earlier, that say some of the transition metals are more of a near-term play, and then the hydrogen economy comes sort of later, 10, 15 years down the track. But I mean, you've no doubt that it's got a big part to play then in decarbonising or the shift to the low carbon economy.
Yeah, well, for us, it's the important bit, and the area that we think we can tap in the short term is we move to renewables as our primary input energy to all of our sites. In fact, by the end of this year, we'll have all of our South American sites on renewable energy input. And with our new hydrogen battery truck that we're developing, we can use those renewable sources to produce hydrogen, and we can use the hydrogen to replace diesel. Now, we think in today's world that makes economic sense on a smaller scale for hydrogen, but big scale infrastructure projects in hydrogen are probably still 10 to 15 years away. And so that'll be a second phase in the hydrogen journey, which we think will then really kick PGM consumption along, used as a catalyzer in those processes. So we see it in two parts.
Okay. I mean, look, so far we've painted a pretty rosy picture of the outlook for commodities. I mean, is there anything that worries you that could sort of trip up, if it's not a super cycle, this period of structurally higher prices? Is it slowing China? Is it geopolitics? Because, yeah, we seem to live in a more, well, not as a connected world as perhaps we might have done 10, 15 years ago. I mean, is there anything out there that concerns you?
Yeah, look, I think geopolitics, fractures in trade, things like the China not taking Australian met coal, short term, great news for the met coal guys. The price goes from $150 to $400 a tonne. It just doesn't make sense for ships to be literally passing in the night. The world's short shipping capacity. Now we've got it all tied up in met coal going to all weird and wonderful places around the planet. That's part of the reason why met coal prices are up, or high quality met coal prices are up. We can't have those things happen. And obviously instability reduces long-term stability and demand. It impacts elimination of poverty. Those are the things that threaten us and worry me in terms of the overall long-term demand picture. But I am an optimist, and I think we can solve those problems. Then I think it's the environmental impacts, and if we in the industry don't get control of our key processes and eliminate the sort of social disasters we've seen, and whilst they're few and far between, they are terribly impactful when they occur. So they have to be managed and eliminated. We have to rebuild confidence with our communities and our governments, and we have to do this in partnership. So I think we've got a lot of work to do to get people's confidence, but whether they like it or not, we're absolutely critical to the future development of an ecologically, environmentally sustainable world. We've just got to do it better.
Okay. Now, if we go back to the last super cycle, I mean, it sort of came to an end, didn't it? Because, okay, China slowed a little bit, but there was like this tsunami of supply that came on. This time around, that can't really happen, can it? Because as you said earlier, it's taking longer to bring a mine on. It's difficult to find, easy, low-hanging fruit, I think, in mining-friendly jurisdictions. Although, I mean, what is a mining-friendly jurisdiction now where you see some of the things that are happening in South America? So, I mean, there's no reason to think, is there, that in 2030 we're going to see sort of a tsunami of supply that comes on and crushes, the prices we've got at the moment. I mean, that is different this time, isn't it?
Well, to be honest, I haven't seen a stream of new projects being talked about by you or anyone else in the market. So yes, there are a few there, and we're bringing one on in the next couple of months in Quellaveco. But we're probably a bit of an odd group out at the moment. We're going to deliver what is the largest mining development that they've seen in South America. And we're on track, both track, time and budget. Unfortunately, that's not the norm. And with the challenges, connecting with communities, understanding how to develop your project consistent with their aspirations for the community, make sure that connects with the government's aspirations for what it wants to do and fund on a broader basis, and then making sure that you can get your product to market. These are all big challenges that literally in the last 20 years doubled in time frame and probably tripled in cost. So as you say, we're going to need higher prices to get that production on the ground, but it also takes time. So I think the period between 2030, 2040 is going to be characterised by a squeeze, not having the commodities to feed the energy transition. I think there's a lot of people that are going to probably scratching their heads already, wondering how they're going to meet their energy target or carbon targets for 2040 and 2050.
So could we see a situation where commodity prices move to sort of scarcity pricing? Or, I mean, certainly we're already at incentive pricing for some commodities already, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I think you'll see thrifting, more recycle. The pressure will be on recycling, so reclaiming metals. There'll be a lot more work going there. We're thinking about how we play in that game. You'll see substitution. You know, the good thing about the human race is we're pretty resourceful and we'll find a way. And the higher the prices, the more pathways we tend to find to solve the problem. So we'll solve the problems, but we're going to be tight on primary supply for quite a while. And so I think the pricing will be good, but you'll also see other things happen that will somehow balance the requirements. But I think it'll take longer for us to meet our energy transition goals. If you're not well on the way already, you're in trouble. And certainly from our point of view, that's why we felt we had to get away quickly on the renewables. The new plan for South Africa is very important to us. And if you haven't got that pathway pretty well mapped, I think you're in trouble.
And do you think Anglo will be a big recycling business one day then? Or?
Look, I think recycling will be a material business. I remember 5 or 6 years ago when we built the whole marketing trading business, and we were losing about $400 million when you looked at the pricing of our goods compared to competitors. Today, we've actually blown that gap away, and I can't talk about the EBITDA contribution for our marketing business until I do my results, but people know from the half year that we're in pretty good shape and the contribution is pretty significant. We're very proud of what the guys have done. And that's an example of how we build adjacencies around our primary operations. And we think that's going to be the key to continue to improve our margins and our return on capital. And certainly some of the strategic moves we've made are starting to look pretty good today as we look at these opportunities.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it is a sort of the model of the industry is kind of changing in that respect.
Yeah.
Okay. But I mean, just going back to the question of China, does it concern you that Chinese growth might slow, that they do switch to a more consumer, sort of facing economic model, and that impacts demand for raw materials? Or
well, it doesn't concern me,
right.
because we always saw it as an inevitability.
Yeah.
Look, they're still investing in infrastructure. We're even seeing it now. But over time, they'll become more goods and services orientated. That's good for the diamond business. So I'm in a good place there. It's also good for platinum as well. So we've got a few bets both ways, and we're quite unique in that respect. But if you look at 3 or 4 or 5% growth off the base that they have today compared to where it was 10 years, it's not a bad place to be. And for us, growth in those areas that are endemically stricken by poverty, I think is a really important growth sector for us in the medium to longer term. So I'm still very optimistic. The world's got a long way to go. We've still got billions of people that we want to see lifted out of poverty. And for us, that means there will be continuing demand for the products we produce and continuing demand from high-end products that US, Europe, China, rest of Asia, all parts of the world will want. So we're not worried. We're working out where best to put our capital to take advantage of those big trends.
And do you think in this environment of really strong demand for a whole host of commodities, that resource-rich nations are going to want a greater slice of the economics? Is that a trend we're going to see more of, do you think?
Well, I think the first point I would make is they will get a much higher gross take on the basis that commodity prices are higher.
Mm-hmm.
If at the end of the day they decide to become uncompetitive, then they risk companies like ourselves allocating our capital to other jurisdictions. And so in the end, it's natural for countries to look at taking a bigger slice of the cake. But if you take the long view, policy certainty, being supportive of the industry, proves that you get the best long-term benefits. And the studies over the last 30 or 40 years have proven those companies that remain policy-focused, consistent approach, have the most resilient long-term industries that benefit the people in the long term. And long-thinking governments will tend to look at that data and I think make the right calls, in our view.
So, Mark, let's just wrap up and pull together a few of the strands that we've had in this conversation this afternoon. I mean, so we're not in a cycle, as we saw back in the early 2000s, a China-driven one, but we are in an environment of structurally higher prices. Would that be a fair summation of how you see the industry going forward?
Yeah, I like the way you summarise that. And the reason I say it, and I say it like that, is if we talk to it as a super cycle, it may mislead or lead people to think it's just a broad, everything's up. And I think it's a bit more complex than that. And in that context, people should be careful about where they invest their dollars.
But at the same time, there are some genuinely exciting opportunities out there in some of these commodities.
Yeah, and I think we can really see some very strong pricing, particularly in a few commodities and a few companies. But at the same time, each comes with a bit of risk. But generally, I think it's a good environment for the mining industry, one that you should be able to make money in, and it's got a sense of long-term in there as well.
Best environment you've seen in your career, or?
I think 2004-05 was the best I'd seen on a broad basis, and that was obviously driven off China. This is the best I've seen where you've got multiple issues in play. It could turn out to be the best environment I've seen in my time, but I wouldn't say that yet.
Okay, we have to see how things unfold. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for your time and sharing thoughts on what is a pretty crucial issue, I think, for the industry, and one that everyone is debating at the moment. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for the opportunity. Always a pleasure.